You're replaceable, Claire. Effective immediately, you're fired. Those words hit me harder than a sucker punch, delivered with the same casual tone my boss might use to order a coffee. He didn't even look up from the paperwork on his desk. Just said it, like I was nothing. For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. The air in his cramped corner office suddenly felt thin, the muted hum of the downtown Chicago traffic outside drowning out my thoughts. "I'm sorry," finally managed. Gerald Marsh finally looked up, his pale blue eyes as cold as the February morning. "You heard me. We've decided to go in a different direction. Your position is redundant." Redundant. I'd worked at Beckford and Pine Advertising for 9 years. 9 years of 12-hour days, missed holidays, client crises at midnight, and now I was redundant? "Is this about the Thompson account?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Because," I explained. "It's not about one account," he interrupted, leaning back in his leather chair, the one I'd once helped him pick out after a big client win. "It's about the fact that you're irreplaceable. We need someone who brings fresh energy. New blood. You understand?" I didn't. Not even a little. The word replaceable echoed in my mind like a bad song on repeat. I'd been the one pulling all-nighters to salvage failing campaigns. The one clients called directly because they trusted me more than the execs. The one who'd trained half the people in this building, including, ironically, the junior manager now peeking nervously through the glass wall outside Gerald's office. I realized I was gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that my knuckles were white. "And this is effective when?" "Now," Gerald said almost cheerfully. "HR will process your severance. We'll need your laptop and badge before you leave." I stared at him, fighting the urge to laugh. Severance. As if that could possibly cover the gaping crater he was blowing into my life. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady. I gathered my things in a daze. A few framed photos, my favorite pen, the coffee mug my niece had painted for me. My coworkers avoided my eyes as I walked to the elevator, clutching the cardboard box like it might steady me. The lobby smelled faintly of roasted coffee from the cafe next door. I'd walked through that lobby almost every morning for nearly a decade, usually with a head full of deadlines and to-do lists. But that day the marble floors felt like the surface of another planet. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the biting Chicago wind, the reality hit me. I wasn't just unemployed. I'd been discarded. Erased from the company I'd helped build into something respectable. And worse, he'd called me replaceable. I didn't know it yet, but that one word would be the spark that lit the slow, meticulous fire of my revenge. But before we get there, you need to understand who I was before that moment. And why Gerald Marsh would regret underestimating me. My name is Claire Hanlon. I'm 37 years old, born and raised in Evanston, Illinois, just north of the city. I'm the kind of person who alphabetizes her spice rack and color codes her calendar. My friends call it control freak energy. I call it being prepared. I started at Beckford and Pine fresh out of Northwestern with a degree in marketing and a stubborn belief that hard work would always be rewarded. And for a while it was. I rose from junior account assistant to senior strategist in less than 5 years, outpacing colleagues with fancier connections and shinier resumes. But here's the thing. When you make yourself indispensable in a company run by insecure men, they don't see loyalty. They see a threat. The first signs came years before that meeting in Gerald's office. The subtle credit stealing in presentations, the way my ideas became team contributions only after someone else repeated them. And yet I kept delivering because I believed numbers spoke louder than office politics. Turns out I was wrong. Gerald wasn't the kind of man to feel gratitude for someone making him look good. He was the kind of man who needed to feel like the smartest person in the room. And people like that, they don't keep people like me around forever. By the time I stepped off the curb that morning, clutching my box of personal effects against the icy wind, one truth had settled deep in my bones. I might have been replaceable in Gerald's eyes, but I was about to make myself unforgettable in his nightmares. The first time I realized Gerald might have a problem with me was 6 years before he fired me. It was during a quarterly client review for Braxton Outdoor Gear, one of our biggest accounts at the time. I'd spent weeks assembling the presentation. Every slide was airtight, every market trend backed by solid data. I knew the numbers better than I knew my own phone number. We were seated in the sleek glass conference room on the 23rd floor, the kind of space designed to impress clients with its skyline view. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan, casting orange streaks across the table. I just finished explaining how our targeted social media campaign had increased Braxton's sales by 22% in 3 months. The CEO of Braxton smiled and said, "That's impressive, Claire." Before I could respond, Gerald jumped in with his easy, practiced laugh. "We've got a great team here. I always tell my people that attention to detail is what makes the difference." My people. It was subtle, but I felt it. The way his eyes flicked past me as if I were just another interchangeable cog in his perfect little machine. And then he turned the conversation toward his vision for the next quarter, using my projections like bullet points in his own speech. That was the first time I caught the faint hairline fracture in our working relationship. I told myself it didn't matter. Clients knew the truth. My team knew the truth. And the results spoke for themselves. But cracks have a way of spreading. Over the years, the moments piled up. Gerald taking credit for a last-minute campaign pivot I'd made that saved a luxury hotel account. Him introducing me to a new client as one of our assistants when I was a senior strategist. The way my end-of-year bonuses started shrinking, even as my billable hours went up. It wasn't just Gerald. The company culture had shifted. When I joined, Beckford and Pine was scrappy and hungry, led by people who valued ideas over egos. We celebrated wins together, stayed late because we wanted to, not because we were afraid of the fallout if we didn't. By the time Gerald became managing partner, the air had changed. Late nights were expected. Credit was currency and Gerald was the central bank. He collected it from anyone who'd let him. I wasn't blind to it. I just thought I could outwork it. If there's one thing you need to know about me, it's that I don't back down from a challenge. My parents ran a small diner in Evanston for 30 years. And I grew up bussing tables and balancing the books before I could legally drive. The Hanlons didn't quit. We doubled down. That's probably why I didn't see the warning signs for what they were. One of those signs came wrapped in a bright bow named Emily Vargas. Fresh out of NYU with a glossy resume and a confidence that didn't come from experience. Gerald hired her as an account coordinator on my team, but within a month she was presenting directly to clients. "She's got that fresh energy I was telling you about," Gerald said in a meeting one morning, smiling like he'd just discovered fire. Fresh energy. At first I didn't think much of it. Emily was smart and quick on her feet, even if she didn't always know what she was talking about. I took her under my wing, teaching her how to actually deliver on the promises she was making to clients. But then I started noticing things, like the way Gerald lingered in her office, or how she seemed to know about upcoming account shifts before I did. And the way my projects slowly started ending up on her desk. If this were a movie, I might have confronted Gerald right then, demanded to know what was going on. But this wasn't a movie. This was corporate America, and in corporate America, you don't make accusations without evidence. So I kept my head down, kept delivering results. I told myself Gerald needed me too much to cut me loose. I didn't realize he was quietly setting the stage for my exit. It's funny, when you're in the middle of something like that, you don't notice the pattern until it's too late. The missed promotions. The shift of big accounts to other managers. The subtle undermining in meetings. Looking back, I can see it clearly. Gerald didn't fire me on a whim. He'd been paving the road for months, maybe years. And Emily? He was part of the plan. But Gerald made one critical mistake. He underestimated how much I knew about this company. I knew the vendors who'd been quietly overbilling us for years because no one in accounting bothered to cross-check invoices. I knew which clients had threatened to walk because of Gerald's empty promises. I knew which fresh ideas had been bought or stolen from other agencies. And maybe most importantly, I knew exactly how to use that knowledge. I didn't know it yet, but Gerald had just given me all the time and freedom I needed to turn that knowledge into a weapon. The first week after Gerald fired me felt like falling down an elevator shaft in slow motion. I woke up at the same time every morning out of sheer habit, only to sit in my kitchen with a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the skyline beyond my apartment window. The city looked different in the middle of a workday, slower, almost smug, like it knew I didn't belong out there anymore. Friends told me to take time for myself to heal before looking for something new. But they didn't understand. This wasn't about finding another job. This was about what Gerald had said, replaceable. That word had lodged itself deep in my chest like a shard of glass. I kept replaying the last few months in my head, every meeting, every subtle slight. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Gerald hadn't just fired me. He'd erased me from my own legacy. Those accounts I'd built from the ground up? Now Emily's. Those strategies that had made us a top 10 boutique agency in Chicago? Now Gerald's vision. One afternoon about a week after I was let go, I decided to do something radical. Clean out my home office. Not just tidy, purge. I thought it might help me feel in control again. I started with the filing cabinet. Contracts, client briefs, project notes. Years of meticulous documentation. I'd kept copies of everything not out of paranoia but because I believed in being prepared. As I flipped through those folders, something started to click in my mind. There it was in black and white. Proof of the overbilling I'd caught from a media vendor 3 years ago, the one Gerald had brushed off as a clerical error, but quietly continued to use. The email thread where a major client threatened to pull their account unless we met certain deliverables that Gerald had promised but never intended to fulfill. The signed NDA from an influencer campaign that Gerald had recycled for another client without paying for a new license. I wasn't looking for dirt. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. By the time I closed the drawer, my pulse was racing. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing. Gerald Marsh had just handed me a loaded gun. The temptation was immediate and intoxicating. I could go straight to the clients, expose every shady practice. I could forward the vendor invoices to the IRS, drop the NDA violations into a tidy little package for the agency's legal department. One phone call and I could watch his little empire start to burn. But I didn't. Not yet. Because here's the thing, revenge isn't about the first strike. It's about timing. I needed him to feel safe again. I needed him to believe he'd gotten away with it. That way when I finally pulled the trigger, the impact would be absolute. So I did something that probably looked insane from the outside. I disappeared. I stopped answering calls from old coworkers. I let LinkedIn sit untouched. I didn't rant about Gerald on social media, didn't let even a whiff of bitterness slip into the world. If anything, I looked fine. And behind that facade I started to build. The first step was information. I reached out to a few trusted vendors, people who'd known me for years, who'd worked with me directly, not through Gerald. Casual conversations, just catching up. They told me more than I'd even hoped for. Emily was floundering on 2 major accounts and Gerald was scrambling to keep clients from noticing. Morale in the office was tanking under his micromanagement. The second step was leverage. I cataloged everything I had, the invoices, the emails, the contracts. I organized them into neat cross-referenced folders, both physical and digital. And I started building a narrative, one that showed not just incompetence, but a pattern of unethical behavior. The third step, well, that one would take a little longer. It involved patience, precision, and just enough public exposure to make Gerald realize exactly how replaceable I wasn't. I didn't know exactly how it would all unfold yet. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Gerald Marsh was going to beg me to come back. And when he did, I'd be ready to make him pay for every single word. If Gerald thought firing me meant I'd disappear into obscurity, he clearly didn't know me at all. 2 weeks after my departure, I took a train into the city and met with an old contact for lunch. Not in some dingy corner cafe, but at a polished little bistro 2 blocks from Beckford and Pine's office. The kind of place where you were bound to be seen. My contact was Naomi Fletcher, a senior account director at one of Chicago's top PR firms. We'd collaborated on several big campaigns over the years, and she'd always been blunt in a way I appreciated. "So," she said, sipping her sparkling water, "word on the street is you and Gerald had a parting of ways." I smiled like it was no big deal. "That's one way to put it." "Emily Vargas is drowning," Naomi added almost gleefully. "Your old hotel account? They called me last week. Wanted a referral for a new agency. Said she doesn't know her way around a budget spreadsheet." I pretended to be surprised, but inside I felt a small, satisfying spark. "That's too bad," I said lightly. "They were such a good client." Naomi leaned in. "If you're looking, I could use someone with your experience. My team's swamped." It was tempting. A stable paycheck, a respectable title. But Gerald's smug face flashed in my mind and I shook my head. "Not yet. I've got a few things I want to work on first." She didn't press, and I left lunch with something far more valuable than a job offer. Confirmation that Gerald's ship was already taking on water. Over the next month, I expanded my quiet reconnaissance. A coffee here, a drink there, all with former clients, vendors, and even a couple of current Beckford employees who didn't mind venting to someone safely outside the office walls. I didn't ask for dirt, I let it come to me. And it did. Apparently, Gerald's fresh energy wasn't enough to hide the cracks. Emily had missed 2 major deadlines. One client's ad buy had gone to a competitor after a botched pitch, and Gerald had personally alienated the creative team with his constant second-guessing. But here's the thing about corporate damage. It's not enough for people to know there's a problem. For real impact, they have to feel it. That's where I came in. I started small, using information only I would have. Like which ad vendors would accidentally delay placements if they thought they weren't getting enough attention from an agency. Which clients were already frustrated and just needed a nudge to explore other options. Which freelance designers could mysteriously go dark when Gerald's team called, but magically find time when I reached out. None of it could be traced back to me. I never told anyone to break a contract or skip a deadline. I just redirected their priorities. People are funny that way. Give them a reason to work with someone they trust, and they'll happily leave someone they don't twisting in the wind. And all the while I kept my public profile spotless. On LinkedIn I posted occasional industry articles, congratulated former colleagues on their wins, even liked Beckford and Pine's announcements. To the outside world I looked professional, unbothered, and definitely not engaged in a quiet campaign of sabotage. By the time spring thawed into early summer, the groundwork was laid. Gerald had lost 2 long-term accounts, Emily was juggling fires she didn't have the tools to put out, and whispers about instability at Beckford and Pine were making the rounds at industry happy hours. I didn't need to burn the place down, not yet. I just needed Gerald to start smelling the smoke. By June I could feel the shift. At first, Gerald's name came up in conversations with my contacts like a distant weather report, mildly annoying, easily ignored. But now people spoke about him the way you talk about a storm on the horizon. Not here yet, but close enough to make you check your windows. The first real sign came from Hannah Brooks, a media buyer I'd worked with for years. She called me one afternoon, her voice carrying the kind of restrained glee people get when they're delivering gossip. "You'll never guess who I just got off the phone with," she said. "Gerald." Bingo. He wanted to revisit some of the media rates we negotiated last year. Which is hilarious because those rates expired in February. He should know that you were the one who set the contracts. I let her talk, asking just enough questions to keep her going. Hannah didn't know it, but this was exactly what I wanted. Gerald scrambling for leverage he didn't have, forced to fix problems with tools he didn't understand. A week later I heard from Marcus Lee, an art director I'd pulled in for dozens of campaigns during my Beckford years. He was blunt as ever. "Your boy Gerald's in trouble," he said. Emily sent me a brief that looked like it was written in crayon. Client hated the first round, and instead of fixing it, Gerald told them the creative team misunderstood the concept. Now they're threatening to pull the project entirely. I pretended to be sympathetic. "That's rough." "Oh, it gets better," Marcus added. "Client specifically asked if you were still available. Said they'd be happy to bring you back on the account privately if you weren't tied up." There it was, the first whiff of opportunity. The first little crack in Gerald's certainty that I was gone for good. I didn't take the job. Not yet. But I made sure the offer got back to him indirectly. A friend of a friend who still worked at Beckford happened to mention it in the office. Purely in passing, of course. And that's when the calls started. Not from Gerald, he was too proud for that. But from people around him. The operations manager asking if I'd be open to consulting on a limited basis. An old colleague checking if I could drop by and look over a pitch deck that wasn't landing with a major client. Each time I said I was booked up at the moment, but wished them the best. I knew word would get back to Gerald that I was busy, in demand, and absolutely not waiting by the phone for him. Meanwhile I kept tightening the screws. I didn't sabotage anything outright, I didn't need to. I just made sure the lifelines he might grab for were tangled or just out of reach. A vendor who could have saved a delayed campaign suddenly had other commitments. A copywriter Gerald liked working with happened to be on vacation, the week they needed him most. The industry's a small world, you don't have to push hard for the dominoes to fall. By late July, Beckford and Pine had lost 3 major accounts and were on the verge of losing a 4th. Gerald's name was coming up in less flattering contexts now. Whispered questions about his leadership, murmurs about whether the agency had peaked. And I knew deep down, it was only a matter of time before Gerald himself would have to reach out. Not through intermediaries. Not with casual suggestions. No, he'd have to come to me hat in hand. I just had to make sure that when that moment came, I'd have more than a polite no ready for him. It happened on a Tuesday morning in early August. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee, scrolling through campaign analytics for a freelance project, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Claire Hanlon, I answered. A pause just long enough for me to know who it was before he spoke. Claire. Gerald. The way he said my name, cautious testing, made me smile before I could stop myself. I kept my voice neutral. Gerald. How unexpected. I'll get straight to it, he said, but his tone was anything but straight. It was tight, measured, the verbal equivalent of walking a balance beam. We're in a bit of a crunch on the Ashford account. The client has requested you. I let a beat of silence stretch between us. Requested me? That's interesting. I thought I was replaceable. He cleared his throat. You know how clients are. They get attached to certain styles. I sipped my coffee slowly. You mean results? He didn't take the bait. Look, I was wondering if you'd consider coming in for a few days. Just to help get things back on track. A few days. As if I could drop everything and play cleanup crew on a whim. As if the last 6 months hadn't happened. I'm actually booked solid for the next few weeks, I said. But I appreciate the offer. There was that pause again, longer this time. Claire, I'll be honest. Things have been challenging here since you left. Hearing him say it out loud was like biting into the sweetest piece of fruit after months of waiting for it to ripen. Gerald, I'm sorry to hear that, I said, making sure every syllable was dripping with polite distance. I hope you can turn it around. We could make it worth your while, he added quickly, the salesman in him pushing through the cracks. Consulting fee, flexible schedule. I'll think about it, I said, cutting him off. Send me the details by email. And then I hung up before he could answer. I didn't need the details. I already knew what this was. The first real sign that Gerald understood just how wrong he'd been. But I also knew something else. Walking back into Beckford and Pine too soon would rob me of the ending I wanted. This wasn't about patching up one account. This was about showing everyone, including Gerald, that the agency's decline wasn't bad luck. It was the absence of me. So I decided to make him wait. Over the next 2 weeks, I made sure my name came up in every conversation he had about solutions. I spoke at a small marketing conference downtown, knowing full well half the room would report back to him. I landed 2 high-profile freelance contracts and posted just enough about them online to make it clear I was thriving. The more visible my success became, the more I knew it would gnaw at him. Because for a man like Gerald, nothing is worse than watching someone you underestimated become impossible to ignore. And I wasn't just aiming for impossible to ignore. I was aiming for unforgettable. It took less than a week for Gerald to call again. This time he didn't bother with the small talk. Claire, I need you to come in, he said, his voice tight enough to snap. Ashford is threatening to pull the account unless you're on it. They've given us 48 hours to respond. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of his words settle. 48 hours. I could almost see him in his office, pacing behind that mahogany desk, tugging at his tie like it was strangling him. That's unfortunate, I said, keeping my tone cool. But I'm still booked. Name your rate. I smiled to myself. This was new territory. Gerald was the kind of man who treated budgets like gospel when negotiating with staff. The fact that he'd thrown that line out told me he was no longer thinking in numbers, he was thinking in survival. It's not just about my rate, I said slowly. It's about terms. What kind of terms? His voice was wary, but I heard the faintest undercurrent of hope. I don't work without full autonomy, I said. No micromanaging, no approvals on my strategy. If I take this on, I run it my way. That's doable, he said, though I knew the idea of relinquishing control made his skin crawl. And I choose my own team. No one assigned to me. I decide who touches the account. Silence. Then, fine. Just tell me you'll do it. I'll consider it, I said, deliberately echoing my answer from before. Send me everything you've got on the current campaign. I'll review and let you know. By the time I hung up, I knew he'd send the files within the hour. Desperation does that to people. It strips away the layers of ego until they'll agree to almost anything. When the documents landed in my inbox, I opened them like I was unwrapping a gift. And in a way it was. The work was sloppy. Messaging inconsistent, analytics ignored, timelines a disaster. Emily's fingerprints were all over it, and not in a good way. This wasn't just a failing campaign. It was an open wound. And here's where Gerald had really messed up. He'd given me an inside look at the agency's current operations. Every delay, every missing deliverable, every client complaint was laid out in glorious detail. Information I could, and would, use. But not yet. Instead, I sent him a short, professional email the next morning. Gerald, I'm willing to take on Ashford under the terms we discussed. I'll need a 3-month contract minimum, paid up front. If that works for you, I'll start Monday. He agreed within 15 minutes. No negotiation, no counteroffer. Just a yes. As I closed my laptop, I felt that familiar hum of anticipation. Because stepping back into Beckford and Pine wasn't about saving Gerald. It was about setting the stage for the moment I'd take everything from him, right in front of his own team. And he was about to help me do it. Walking back into Beckford and Pine after 6 months felt surreal. The reception area was the same. Polished marble floors, overwatered plants, that faint scent of expensive cologne and copier toner. But the energy was different. Tighter. Like the air before a summer storm. The receptionist, a new girl I didn't recognize, looked startled when I introduced myself. Oh, welcome back, she said, glancing toward the glass-walled offices beyond. I caught the flicker of movement near Gerald's office, his blinds shifting as if someone had just let them fall back into place. He knew I was here. Emily was the first to approach me. She looked tired in a way makeup couldn't fix. The brittle smile, the tight shoulders, the faint shadows under her eyes. Claire, she said, her voice carrying just enough false brightness to be insulting. I hear you're consulting on Ashford. That's right, I said evenly. I'll need full access to the account files. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Of course. I'll have them sent over. Translation. She tried to delay me, maybe even bury me in incomplete information. I didn't care. I already had enough from Gerald's files to get started, and I knew how to find the rest without asking her twice. The Ashford team was a mess. In my first 30 minutes at the conference table, I heard 2 different versions of the campaign timeline, 3 conflicting budget estimates, and not a single clear deliverable. The junior account execs avoided eye contact with me like kids waiting for the principal to hand down punishment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't criticize. I just asked questions, the kind that make people realize exactly how much they've missed. By the end of the meeting, half the team was scribbling notes, the other half frantically updating project trackers. Gerald popped in as we wrapped up, flashing that politician's smile he wore like armor. Good to have you back in the building, Claire, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I gave him a polite nod. Good to be here. It was a lie, of course. I wasn't here to be back. I was here to dismantle his illusion of control from the inside. That afternoon I started building my own network within the office. Not with Gerald's chosen favorites, but with the people who actually kept the place running. The production assistant who knew which vendors were on the verge of walking. The IT guy who'd seen Gerald's frantic late-night email chains. The finance clerk who processed every one of those inflated vendor invoices. I didn't dig for dirt. I just listened. And people, when they feel seen and respected, will tell you everything without realizing it. By Friday, I knew more about the agency's current weaknesses than Gerald probably did. I also knew Ashford wasn't the only account in trouble. There were 3 more teetering on the edge, all high-profile, all revenue-heavy. If they went, so did Beckford and Pine's reputation. And here's the delicious part. I was in a position to save them. But only in a way that would make Gerald look like he couldn't run his own agency without me. The game had changed. I wasn't just working the Ashford account anymore. I was setting the terms of the agency's survival, and Gerald didn't even know it yet. The first time I saved Ashford, I made sure Gerald wasn't even in the room. It was a Wednesday morning conference call. The client's VP of marketing sounded ready to walk, his voice clipped, each question a loaded bullet aimed at our credibility. The rest of the Beckford team sat frozen on mute, their eyes flicking toward the little camera dot on their laptops like it might save them. Let's take a step back, I said, my tone calm but firm. What I'm hearing is that you feel the campaign's current direction isn't resonating with your target audience. Is that right? There was a pause. Then, exactly. From there, I walked them through a revised concept I'd sketched out the night before. Clear, simple, effective. I didn't overpromise, didn't spin. I just gave them something solid to hold on to. By the time we ended the call, the VP's tone had shifted from hostile to cautiously optimistic. Let's see a draft by Friday, he said. When I stepped out of the conference room, half the team exhaled in unison. The junior exec mouthed a silent thank you. Gerald heard about it, of course. He cornered me later in the hallway. Good work on Ashford, he said, his voice low enough to keep it between us. Just doing my job, I replied, walking past him before he could say more. What I didn't tell him was that I'd deliberately CC'd the client on certain updates without copying him. Not to hide anything, but to make it clear who was driving the project forward. The subtlest shifts in perception are the hardest to undo. Over the next month, I repeated the pattern with 3 more accounts teetering on the brink. Each time I came in quietly, fixed the problem, and made sure the client associated my name, not Gerald's, with the turnaround. I didn't grandstand. I didn't brag. I let the results speak for themselves. And clients talk. Soon enough, I was getting calls directly from VPs and CMOs, bypassing the internal account leads entirely. They weren't asking for Beckford and Pine anymore. They were asking for Claire. The staff noticed too. The IT guy started sending me heads-up emails about server glitches before they hit the rest of the office. The finance clerk forwarded me reports Gerald probably assumed no one else saw. Even Emily, strained and brittle, began deferring to me in meetings without realizing it. Gerald was still technically in charge. But in the eyes of the people who mattered, the ones who signed checks and delivered campaigns, I was the authority in the room. And the best part? Gerald couldn't publicly acknowledge it without admitting that firing me had been the biggest mistake of his career. The more indispensable I became, the more isolated he looked. And isolation in leadership is the first step toward collapse. I wasn't going to push him off the ledge. I was going to let him step off it himself, thinking it was solid ground. By September, the office felt different. It wasn't just that clients were calling me directly, it was how the staff reacted when I walked in. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People leaned in when I spoke during meetings. The newer employees, the ones who hadn't worked with me before, started treating me like the unspoken authority in the room. And Gerald noticed. One Monday morning, I caught him lingering in the doorway of the conference room while I presented an Ashford progress update. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there watching as the client's project manager laughed at one of my dry jokes and nodded along like we'd been working together for years. When the meeting ended, he stepped aside to let me pass. "You've got away with them," he said, his tone flat. "Years of practice," I replied, not breaking stride. The truth was, it wasn't just practice. It was trust, something Gerald had never learned how to build. He was good at selling the idea of a solution, but I was the one who delivered it. Clients could feel that difference even if they couldn't put it into words. It started small. A client asking if I'd be looped in on a new initiative before signing off. A vendor requesting my approval before moving forward. Internal teams checking with me before committing to deadlines. And then came the first open crack. I was in the break room one afternoon when 2 junior account managers walked in mid-conversation. "If Claire leaves, we're screwed," one said. They froze when they saw me. I smiled slightly and went back to stirring my coffee, but the words stuck. They weren't wrong. The shift in power was happening so gradually that Gerald couldn't call it out without sounding paranoid. And yet I could see the strain on him. The tighter jaw, the clipped tone in emails, the way he'd correct people for calling me a consultant instead of temporary support. Clients were emboldened too. During a strategy call for a new luxury retail account, the client's CMO said casually, "We're thrilled to have Claire leading this. It's why we signed, honestly." Gerald's smile froze. "Claire's part of the team, of course, but this is a Beckford and Pine project," he said, his voice just a hair too sharp. The CMO didn't miss a beat. "Right, but it's Claire's vision that sold us. We'd like her as our main point of contact." I didn't look at him. I just made a note in my pad and kept talking. Moments like that were the real damage. Not public confrontations, but small, undeniable acknowledgments that the center of gravity had shifted. And I wasn't just letting it happen. I was making sure it stuck. Every success, every turnaround, every client win, I tied it to my name in a way that looked organic but was anything but. A quick follow-up email sent directly to the client, summarizing our progress in my words. A courtesy call to check in after a milestone without Gerald on the line. I was building something bigger than a portfolio or a contract renewal. I was building a future where Gerald couldn't move a single major account without me. And once that dependency was absolute, I'd take away the one thing he valued more than money: control. It was bound to happen. After weeks of letting my influence grow unchecked, Gerald finally tried to remind everyone whose name was on the door. It started during a high-stakes meeting with the Ashford leadership team. The campaign was exceeding expectations. Engagement up 38%, sales climbing. Their board finally convinced the rebrand was worth the money. I was midway through walking them through the next phase when Gerald interrupted. "Actually," he said, leaning forward with his hands clasped, "I think we should pivot the Q4 rollout to focus more on influencer partnerships. It's where the market's headed, and frankly, it was my original vision for this campaign." I could feel the temperature in the room drop a few degrees. The Ashford VP glanced at me, not him. I smiled politely. "That's an interesting suggestion, Gerald. The data we've collected so far suggests our direct-to-consumer push is outperforming projections. But if the team wants to explore influencers, we can run a comparative analysis before committing resources." Translation: nice try but no. The VP nodded. "Let's stick with Claire's plan for now. We can revisit if the numbers shift." Gerald's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. After the meeting, he followed me into the hallway. "You could have backed me up in there," he said. "I backed up the data," I replied evenly. "That's what the client's paying for." The truth was, I could feel him starting to flail. He didn't realize it yet, but every time he tried to wrestle back control, he was handing me more credibility with the clients. They could see the contrast. My steady, fact-based decisions against his ego-driven pivots. That afternoon, I decided to accelerate things. I reached out to 2 other major accounts, ones I wasn't officially assigned to, just to check in. Harmless questions about their satisfaction, upcoming needs, whether they had concerns the agency hadn't addressed. Within days, both accounts requested me on their teams. It wasn't a demand, not yet, but it was enough to make Gerald notice. By the end of the week, he called me into his office. "Claire," he said, his tone clipped, "I've been getting requests from clients to put you on their accounts. That's not how this works." I tilted my head. "Isn't it? They're paying for the best possible service. If they believe I can provide it." "That's not the point," he snapped, then caught himself, softening his tone. "You work for me." I met his eyes. "No, Gerald. I work with you. There's a difference." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. I left his office knowing something had shifted again. Gerald wasn't just worried about losing control, he was starting to realize he already had. And I wasn't done tightening the noose. By mid-October, Gerald wasn't running the agency anymore. Not really. He still sat in his glass-walled office, still signed the big contracts, still gave his little speeches at Monday morning stand-ups. But when something actually needed fixing, when money was on the line, all roads led to me. And everyone knew it. The turning point came with the Lancaster account, one of Beckford and Pine's oldest and most prestigious clients. They'd been with the agency for 15 years, and losing them would be like ripping out the company's foundation. The call came on a Thursday morning. Lancaster CEO was furious. Deadlines missed. Ad copy off-brand. Creative assets nowhere near the quality they expected. They'd already begun meetings with other agencies. Gerald's voice was tight when he knocked on my door. "Claire, I need you in the Lancaster meeting this afternoon." "You have a team on Lancaster," I said without looking up from my laptop. "They've made a mess of it. They want you." His tone was flat, but his eyes told the truth. This wasn't a request. It was a white flag. I let the silence hang just long enough for him to feel it. "All right," I said at last. "But I'll need full control of the account, effective immediately. My budget. My team. No interference." He hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. "Fine." That afternoon, I walked into the Lancaster meeting like I owned the place. The CEO's expression shifted the moment I sat down. "Claire," he said, relief in his voice. "Thank God." 2 hours later, I had a revised strategy on the table, a new timeline everyone could live with, and a commitment from Lancaster to pause their search for another agency. When we left the conference room, Gerald muttered, "You saved it." I didn't bother correcting him. We both knew the truth. I hadn't saved his account. I just secured mine. Because here's what Gerald didn't realize. Lancaster wasn't just a client. They were my exit plan. For weeks I'd been planting seeds with the decision makers there, small, subtle things. A comment about how much more nimble we could be outside the constraints of a traditional agency. A story about how other firms were offering more flexible terms. Never a pitch, never a proposal, just ideas dropped into conversation like pebbles into a pond. And the ripples had started to spread. 2 days after the meeting, Lancaster's CEO called me directly. "If you ever decide to go independent," he said, "call me first. We'd bring the whole account with us." I smiled into the receiver. "I'll keep that in mind." That was the moment I knew Gerald's days of control were over. Not because I'd outperformed him, I'd done that for years. But because now I didn't need him or his agency at all. All that was left was to decide how and when to make him realize it. The opportunity came faster than I expected. It was late November and the office was buzzing with nervous energy. A major pitch for a high-profile luxury goods brand, Vellum and Company, was set for the following week. Landing them would mean millions in revenue and instant industry clout. Losing them would be a public embarrassment. Gerald had been hyping the pitch for months. He saw it as his moment to re-establish dominance. What he didn't realize was that most of the pitch deck, the research, the creative concepts, the data projections, was built on the foundation I'd laid for Lancaster and Ashford. And here's where it got interesting. 3 days before the pitch, Vellum's marketing director called me directly. "Claire," she said, "we've reviewed the preliminary deck and we'd really like you to present. Your approach just lands with us." I knew my answer immediately, but I didn't give it to her yet. "I'll need to clear that with Gerald," I said, keeping my tone neutral. I didn't clear it with Gerald. Instead, I waited until the final prep meeting to drop the bomb. We were in the main conference room, the whole leadership team gathered. Gerald was pacing in front of the projection screen, running through his talking points. When he finally stopped and looked at me, I said it. "Vellum's team asked for me to lead the presentation." The room went quiet. Gerald's smile faltered. "This is my pitch," he said. "It's their request," I replied calmly. "We can ignore it, but that's your call." He looked around the room, searching for support. None came. The creative director avoided his eyes. The head of strategy stared at his notes. Finally, Gerald exhaled through his nose. "Fine. You take point." The pitch was flawless. I'd timed every beat, anticipated every question. And by the time we wrapped, Vellum's team was already talking next steps. The handshake at the end felt less like a business formality and more like sealing a personal victory. The next morning, Lancaster's CEO called again. This time he didn't dance around it. "We're ready to move," he said. "If you're serious about going independent, we'll follow. And if you bring Vellum, we'll double our commitment." That was the final piece. I'd been building the structure for months. My own agency, lean and nimble, with a hand-picked team of people who actually knew how to deliver. All I'd needed was the right moment to walk away and take the crown jewels with me. I drafted my resignation that afternoon. No drama, no accusations. Just a single page stating my last day would be in 2 weeks. Gerald called me into his office within minutes of reading it. "You can't do this," he said, voice tight. "We have too much riding on these accounts." I kept my expression neutral. "You mean my accounts?" He leaned forward. "I'll double your rate. I'll give you equity. Whatever it takes. Just don't walk." There it was, the moment I'd been waiting for. Gerald Marsh, the man who'd once called me replaceable, now offering me the keys to his kingdom just to keep me. I stood, smoothing the front of my jacket. "I appreciate the offer, Gerald. But you were right the first time. I am replaceable. You'll figure it out." And then I left his office, leaving him sitting there in silence, staring at the empty space where his control used to be. 2 weeks later, my new agency launched with Lancaster and Vellum as founding clients. By the end of the quarter, 2 more of Beckford and Pine's biggest accounts had quietly joined them. Gerald's empire didn't crumble overnight. It just kept shrinking, piece by piece, until all that was left was the echo of what it used to be. Me. I didn't just walk away with the clients. I walked away with the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the best revenge isn't proving someone wrong. It's making them beg to be proven right and then walking away anyway. The day I moved into my new office, I brought exactly two things from my time at Beckford and Pine: the coffee mug my niece painted for me years ago and the pen I'd always kept on my desk. Everything else stayed behind. The files, the framed awards, even the perfectly tailored work wardrobe I'd built to fit someone else's vision of success. I didn't need any of it anymore. Lancaster So stopped by that morning with pastries, Vellum's team sent champagne, and my new staff, a small group of people I'd handpicked for their talent and integrity, were buzzing with the kind of energy I hadn't felt in years. We weren't just chasing accounts. We were building something we actually believed in. It was strange how quickly Gerald faded from my day-to-day thoughts. He'd taken up so much space in my head for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to move without looking over my shoulder. I heard through the industry grapevine that Beckford and Pine had lost 2 more accounts in the first quarter after I left. That Emily had resigned. That Gerald had started showing up to networking events alone, pitching for smaller and smaller contracts. I didn't feel sorry for him, because this was never really about him. It was about me. About the years I'd spent believing that loyalty would protect me, that if I worked hard enough, the people in charge would see my value and treat me accordingly. About the way I'd let someone else define my worth, until they decided it was zero. Walking away wasn't just the end of a job. It was the end of that version of me. The one who thought she had to prove herself by playing someone else's game. Now I make my own rules. I choose the clients, the projects, the people I work alongside. And I've learned something important. Success feels different when it's yours alone. Not because someone allowed it, not because you were in the right place at the right time, but because you built it piece by piece with your own hands. Gerald once told me I was replaceable. He was right. At his company I was. But in my own life, in my own business, in the world I've built since walking away, I am anything but. And that's a truth no one can fire you from.